Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's meeting of Keele World Affairs. As you'll see, we're graced with the presence tonight of Professor Mark Galeotti, who's returning to Keele. He came a few years ago, and he was also a lecturer at Keele many years ago, at the beginning of his academic career. You might have noticed, I don't know if it was on the slide or not, but he's had a glittering academic career since he left Keele 20-odd years ago. But more importantly, he's also been a very prolific author, mainly concerned with Russian issues, which is obviously very current now, so history's caught up with him and been very kind to him in that respect. Also written quite a lot on crime as well, and occasionally written both about crime and Russia together. So I think it's over 30 books that Mark's written. Very well respected historian and Russist. Did you describe yourself as, Mark? Russianist, sorry, it's not a word I'd heard before. Copies of his books are for sale in the foyer if anybody wants to buy one in the interval. And if you're asking very nicely, he'll sign it for you as well if you pay the money for it. So tonight it's can the West ever be reconciled with Russia? An interesting choice of words, because of course that reminds us that we were once allies, of course, with Russia. You know, 2 world wars on the same side. So can we get back into bed with them, so to speak? And it also, of course, highlights the fact that we're far from reconciled with Russia at the moment. As Gillian Tett told us last week, many of you will recall that Gillian said that, in most strident terms, that she considered that we're actually at war with Russia at the moment, and that's a view that's been expressed by many people in recent months. The Joint Head of Staff, Defence Staff, said it a few weeks ago. But anyway, perhaps Mark can fill us in on all the interesting longer view issues concerning Russia and bring us up to date and perhaps give us his thoughts on where we're going over the next year or two. So a very warm welcome, Professor Mark Galeotti.
Yes, delighted to be back at Keele after so long. It has to be said the Westminster Theatre was rarely so full when it was undergraduates. Don't know why. Yes, getting back into bed. The idea of getting back into bed with Vladimir Putin is not a particularly elevating thought. But the wider question, can the West ever be reconciled with Russia? Well, the short and blunt answer is, one way or the other, we bloody better be. And that's obviously not something that is entirely one-sided. It's not just us, it's also, in due course, Russia has to kind of change. So let me talk a little bit about precisely this wider issue, because Russia is not going anywhere. Russia is not going to change just because we tell it to, though there are things we can do to help nudge it in directions we might want. More often, though, actually, there are things we can do to really dramatically worsen the situation, which I think we have to avoid. But the interesting start point about this whole notion of reconciling is this. Little health warning. Some of what I'm going to say is going to sound as if I'm trying to sugarcoat Putin's Russia. I really don't want to do that. There is a reason why I was in the first batch of Brits who were banned indefinitely from Russia in June 2022. It's probably the only time in my life in which I'll find myself on the same list as Piers Morgan. Or at least so I hope. So, you know, it's not in any way meant to take away the horrors of this imperial war that is being waged against Ukraine, or indeed the increasingly authoritarian repression which is being carried out within Russia. But on the other hand, what's striking is the Soviet Union did rather worse things. I did my PhD on the impact on the Soviet Union of its war in Afghanistan. We don't really talk about that war. Well, it was a long way away and so forth. But if one looks at the proportions of populations killed or forced to become refugees abroad, Afghanistan was a much bloodier war than what's going on in Ukraine. Again, the usual thing. I'm not saying what's going on in Ukraine is not terrible. The Soviet Union generally was much more repressive through most of its time, much more thuggishly brutal, and indeed carried out often rather worst atrocities in Western countries. And yet, at the same time, we maintained diplomatic relations at a higher level than we do now. It's an interesting, I think, sign of the times that we seem to now feel dialogue is a reward for being a good boy. That we will not talk to you while you're being bad. I would argue that it's actually our antagonists that we need to talk to all the more frequently. Talking does not mean conceding. Talking does not even necessarily mean negotiating. It means talking. So one way or the other, we're going to have to find some way of existing on the same planet as the Russian Federation. The war is going to end. I think it's by no means impossible that the war is going to end this year. I don't think the current peace negotiations are going to crack it. But actually, what's striking is these negotiations, unlike previous ones, are dealing with a lot more of the tedious nuts and bolts. This is the thing about now diplomacy in Trump world, and like it or not, and most of the time not, we do now all live in Trump world. Trump had managed to reverse the usual process of negotiation and diplomacy. The classic way is the diplomats, the experts, the nerds and the wonks meet often, frequently, behind closed doors to try and iron out deals. And then the heads of state come in at the end for the big, showy public event, the signing of the document and such like. Under Trump, what we get are splashy public statements followed by desperate attempts to work out if anything can actually be done to make these statements into fact. And when it comes to the Ukraine war, time and time again, we have seen that they can't. This is an incredibly complex issue to negotiate. But these talks do seem to be making some progress in dealing with the less exciting nuts and bolts of if there is, for example, as the Russians want, a Ukrainian withdrawal from certain territories, how would this be handled? Meanwhile, what kind of security guarantees would Ukraine get, not just from Russia, because clearly they're not going to trust those, but also from the West? The things that need to be talked about before you reach a big deal. My suspicion is that these talks are in due course going to peter out, but that then we'll have a new round of talks, maybe in late spring, which actually may well have greater success. Because in some ways, by that point, everyone will have known what the crucial issues are, what needs to be done to achieve peace. So it is possible that there will be peace in Ukraine, or at least that the guns will have stopped firing. But that does not really mean peace in the big picture. You know, are we at war with Russia? Is Russia at war with us? The trouble is often with our whole vocabulary. As I discuss in my book, The Weaponization of Everything, available in the foyer, that in this modern day and age, often wars are not fought on the battlefield. They are fought through economic pressure, through political manipulation, through a whole variety of other means, and they are often fought, frankly, between allies. I mean, you think of what the United States does, and that's a fairly egregious example of using muscle and pressure and intimidation and bluster to try and get your own way. Because what are wars but attempts to get the other side to do something it doesn't want to do. Are we at war with Russia? Sanctions, which we have leveled against Russian individuals and the Russian economy as a whole. Sanctions is just another way of saying economic warfare. Meanwhile, the Russians are launching constant campaigns of sabotage, subversion, disinformation, the like, to try and divide us, to paralyze us more than anything else. Unfortunately, I don't think that will change so long as Putin is in the Kremlin. As far as Putin's concerned, what's happening in Ukraine is not first and foremost, or not solely, a war with Ukraine. Why? Because he is prey to the worst kinds of Russian prejudice about Ukrainians. Ukrainians, Russians, Belarusians. Three peoples who, like it or not, their history, their fate, their culture, their languages are intertwined. What do the Russians think about Belarusians? I think they think of Belarusians as the Scandinavian Russians. They're like Russians, but a bit cooler, a bit more efficient. How do they see Ukrainians? My own sense is they see Ukrainians as, and I'm going to pile one cultural stereotype on top of another, they see Ukrainians as the Italian Russians. They have the best music and the best food, but they are also incompetent. And I say this as a half Italian, I should add. Now again, I'm not, sort of validating that perspective, and it'll be interesting to see how Russian perspectives of Ukraine change, considering what's been happening over the last 4 years. But I think this is very much Putin's perspective, and as far as Putin is concerned, what's happening in Ukraine is a proxy war with the West. That Ukraine would not be still fighting were it not for the West. And to a degree, he's right. The West is bankrolling Ukraine. The West is providing all sorts of equipment and aid of every kind, from Patriot missiles through to medical supplies. So, peace in Ukraine is not going to convince Putin that we are not committed to hostile operations against Russia. Because Putin, for me, is the last gasp Homo Sovieticus. It's interesting that, he's a 73-year-old ex-KGB nationalist who has surrounded himself with septuagenarian veterans of the KGB, very much people of the same sort of mindset, people who really have not come to terms with the fact that Russia is no longer the Soviet Union, that it is no longer a great power, bestriding the world like an alternative colossus to the United States, that it no longer has sway over these swaths of territory in Eastern Europe, Southern Caucasus, Central Asia, and so forth. And that sense that something has been taken from them has, frankly, metastasized into resentment and anger. Not just what did we lose, but who took it from us? These are the kind of deep-seated cultural perspectives that we're not going to see change. We can moderate Putin's behavior through our actions, through deterring certain behaviors and such like, but we're not going to make him our friend. And so, in the meantime, Europe is going to be arming itself. I don't believe for a moment that Putin actually has military intentions of attacking NATO, which, even without the Americans, European NATO has more troops than the Russians, it's worth noting. But I could be wrong. He could be followed by someone who's even more nationalist. And in any case, we don't want to create temptation. So yes, Europe will arm. So we're going to have, so long as Putin is in the Kremlin, a resentful Russia, which does have disproportionate military clout, and a Europe which will acquire increasing military clout. But Russia will still be there, and there will be a Russia after Putin. Now, I don't think Putin can stand down now. Several times in his political career, he clearly has toyed with the idea of stepping down from the presidency. and one can look at all sorts of different indicators. But the point is, now, I don't think he feels he could do it. The thought that a successor might be tempted to essentially bundle him off to a war crimes tribunal in The Hague in return for a complete lifting of sanctions or something like that, I think are too great for a man who does not naturally trust easily. So Putin's going to be around until illness or maybe some kind of political intrigue, I think that's the least likely option, or just death does the job. I don't know if people have seen the film The Death of Stalin. It's a brilliant, gloriously black comedy. But in many ways, I think it does represent one of the best indications we've got as to what's going to happen if Putin doesn't wake up one morning. There's no one individual, no one institution strong enough to just simply step into his shoes. And so what we're going to see is the behind-the-scenes negotiations behind all these various factions, clans, groups, individuals, and such like. And it'll be a coalition of some kind that ends up choosing who is going to be the next president. And that's good. Coalition politics tends to drag politics in away from the extremes. And my view is it's going to be a generational shift down. And if one looks at the 50-somethings, the early 60-somethings in Russia, in the Russian leadership, these are not wild-eyed ideologues, ultra-nationalists willing to see the world burn as long as they bring down their enemies. No, I mean, these are not nice people either. These people are usually well-padded, affluent, pragmatic kleptocrats. They just want to be able to steal. Steal on an industrial scale and then enjoy that. And look, I'm sure Dubai is very nice. But when it comes down to it, Russians consider themselves to be Europeans. I'll come on to that more in a moment. And where do Russians want to look to safely bank their money, but also to spend it? What's the point in being obscenely rich if you can't send your wife clothes shopping in Paris and your mistress clothes shopping in Milan? If you can't enjoy that nice penthouse in London that you bought and send your kids to a prestigious American university and moor your yacht safely off the Riviera, you know, all of these are things, and indeed just get spare parts for your BMW. You know, there are all kinds of practical incentives why the next political generation of Russians, they're not going to be Democrats, they're not going to be nice people, but they're going to have all kinds of good reasons to want to improve relations with the West. And the interesting thing is this: if one looks at periods in Russian history when a particular sort of personalistic authoritarianism ends, there's almost invariably a little window of opportunity for improved relations with the West. And sometimes that's squandered, and sometimes that gets used. But nonetheless, it tends to be there. So we're going to see a Russia. It's not going to fall apart. It's not going to be fragmented and sort of chopped aside into lots of little ones. It's not going to quickly become a liberal democracy, though I think there are pressures pointing in that direction. But I think we're talking about like 2 political generations after Putin for that. It's also not going to accept humbling, or as they see it, humbling terms from us. We're not going to be able to dictate it. This is not going to be Germany 1945 or Japan or Italy. They're not going to have lost to the degree to which we can basically make our terms with it. So we need some kind of a relationship with it, because frankly, not having a relationship, what does that mean, not having a relationship with Russia? Well, first of all, as now, it means we hand our sort of relationship with Russia to the United States. Now, okay, let's assume that post-Trump we get someone sane. But still, it will be an American president motivated by American interests. Is that necessarily the person Europe wants to have shaping the relationship between the West and Russia. Europe, and I'm going to say Europe, I'm not talking about the European Union, I'm talking about the European continent, needs to be involved in that process. Secondly, the more we are isolating or trying to isolate Russia, we're not doing a very good job of it, it has to be said, but where are we driving it to? On whom does it become increasingly dependent? China. Do we really want to essentially make Russia a vassal state of China's? Because clearly China is the rising power in a way that Russia is not. Now, I don't think there's room for a so-called reverse Kissinger, in which we actually turn Russia against China. Excuse me. But nonetheless, we can at least try not to actually push it into the orbit of the Chinese economy. And more to the point, actually, it's in our interests to be able to resolve issues of common concern with Russia. Back in November, I was in Finland. Now, the Finns have a history with Russia. And it's a weird, complex history. I mean, they were a province of the Russian Empire, but one given actually unique degrees of autonomy. It's worth noting that still, in the middle of Helsinki, there is not only a glorious Russian Orthodox church, all onion domes and so forth, there's also a great big statue to Tsar Alexander II, Alexander the Tsar Liberator. But on the other hand, they've also fought bloody wars with the Russians within living memory. And they know that the Russians have tried to destabilize them. At one point, for example, they were trying to basically push migrants across the border and such like. So the Finns do not have a naive sense of the Russians. And yet, time and time again, what I was hearing in Helsinki was, we need to watch the Russians. That's why we maintain this sort of astonishing large mobilization base for our army. Helsinki, there are enough deep bunker shelters for the entire population of Helsinki. Can you imagine trying to do that for, Stoke-on-Trent, let alone London? But at the same time, though, time and time again, the Finns were saying, but on the other hand, we would like to be able to trade with the Russians. And there are all kinds of different issues, particularly to do with sort of, management in a time of climate change in the high north, in which we really need to be able to talk to the Russians and try and reach some kind of mutually agreeable, mutually pragmatically effective agreements. So there are reasons why we need to talk to the Russians. The interesting thing is there are reasons why the Russians will want to talk to us. Even Putin. Every year, Putin has his, what it used to be called Direct Line, now it's Results of the Year with Vladimir Putin, which is this massive, epic, marathon press conference come telethon, in which not only do we get questions from the press corps, including the BBC's redoubtable Steve Rosenberg, but also questions sent in from all around the country. And it lasts for hours. And there are some poor buggers who actually end up having to watch the whole damn thing just in case there's anything exciting. Though I have to say, I would be impressed if any Western leader was willing to basically sit in front of a camera for 4.5 hours and answer questions. Even though the questions are filtered, and I'm sure he's getting the specific statistics that he cites through an earpiece or whatever, it's actually, I have to say, there's a kind of sort of reluctant, grudging acknowledgement that it's not just an impressive exercise in bladder control. It is also an interesting example of this sort of direct relationship of the Tsar with his subjects. But anyway, in the most recent one of these, at one point, Putin makes his point about, look, we are very willing to cooperate with the Europeans on a basis of mutual respect. Now, a basis of mutual respect, that is a kind of code phrase for as long as the Europeans give us what I want. But anyway, he continues that it's really important, and he adds that actually if you put together the GDP of European countries with Russia's, it's bigger than America's. Now, in part, he was being a bit mischievous, trying to sort of, again, exacerbate transatlantic tensions, but I think only in part. It's also that he was making a point which actually he has been making for the last, well, 26 years since he's been president. That actually, if Russia and Europe can find some way of cooperating more effectively, it gives them a degree of muscle in the world that at the moment both lack. So that was even from someone who is an ultra-nationalist and such like, that was a trail. And in part, this is particularly because of what's happening in the world. Take the United States. Donald Trump, he is an aberration, but he's also a kind of within a context of continuity. One of Donald Trump's fascinating characteristics is, in some ways, he's the guy who says the quiet parts out loud. Americans have, for a long time, become increasingly unhappy with their relationship with Europe, not just on the fact that Europe doesn't spend enough on defense and shelters under the American military umbrella, but also more generally, America sees its future, frankly, as being elsewhere. It sees its future in Latin America and above all in the Pacific. And there is a sense that Europe, with its, particularly the European Union, with its sort of concern with being, as it sees itself, a regulatory superpower, is actually kind of holding America back and is a rival to America. So, sure, we may well get a very different president. Well, I can hope we get a very different president after Trump. But this basic point that actually America is increasingly seeing Europe as either a continent that ought to know its place or as a rival is, I think, pretty much inevitable. But from Russia's point of view, what Trump has reminded them is actually how dangerous America can be. There's a lot of nonsense talked about Trump being some kind of Russian asset or whatever. It's worth noting, if you look at the first Trump presidency, at the end of that presidency, US policy towards Russia was tougher than US policy has been at any point towards Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Trump is interested in Trump. He has a worldview which often aligns with Putin's, a sense that basically big countries get to tell little countries what to do, and a sense that the world is shaped by a handful of powerful men, and they always are men, in his view. So they have a certain sort of commonality of perspective, and one of the reasons, I mean, it's not just Putin. Trump has never met an authoritarian leader he doesn't like. Because I think, and here I'm sort of shamelessly being a sort of amateur psychologist, that essentially Trump is a wannabe strongman. He wants to feel he's in the strongman club, and that's why he panders to them. But he's also a man who's willing to use American military and other muscle, just ask the Iranians, to a far greater degree than most of his predecessors. I remember during Trump 1, if you recall, there was a point when Trump unleashed cruise missiles against Syria after, I was going to say a particularly bad chemical attack, which implies there are the sort of trivial little chemical weapons attacks. No, I mean, but anyway, after a particular chemical weapons attack, Trump launched cruise missiles. And by chance, I was then heading to Moscow shortly thereafter. And I had a meeting with various people from the Russian Foreign Ministry. Now, I've spent 7.5 years in New York, at New York University. And so I went to this meeting thinking, great, I'll get a chance to find out what the Russian perspective is. And they were bombarding me with questions about Trump and what Trump was going to do. And I was saying, guys, I'm not an American citizen. I'm not an American foreign policy specialist. And anyway, I live in New York, which is in many ways a country unto itself. But the point is, it was really striking the degree to which they didn't really know what they were dealing with. And one of them said, this is our worst nightmare. An American president with a relatively low threshold for the use of force, who literally changes his mind overnight, and who doesn't consult with his allies, much less warn his antagonists what he's going to do. And with Trump too, likewise, I think, certainly if you look at the Russian press, the Russian expert discourse, there is a very keen awareness that an America that is unbound, that is no longer feeling so constrained as being the kind of the grown-up that has to be much more concerned with other people's attitudes, is a danger to Russia. Because Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia doesn't have the same power. And then China. Now, the China issue is a really interesting one because it's one where there's a very clear generational divide within the Russian elite. For Putin, his war with Ukraine now eclipses everything else. This is existential for him. His political future, his historical legacy, something we know that he worries about, really depend on him being able to achieve something in Ukraine that he can at least spin as a triumph. And to that end, whatever other sacrifices have to be made, so be it. And obviously a lot of those sacrifices are being done by the Russian people, but also in terms of Russia's position in the world. If you look at what's happened in the South Caucasus, Armenia and Azerbaijan, that was an area where Russia regarded itself as the arbiter, the power broker, the regional hegemon. Well, Russia has more or less lost its positions there. It's Turkey, it's Iran, it's the United States who are now basically running the table there. Central Asia, again, the countries of the former Soviet countries of Central Asia, Russia used to be the security guarantor there, no longer. So now these countries are doing the classic thing of essentially pitching all the other players off against each other. Beijing, Brussels, Berlin, Washington, I wish there was a B I could throw in there to keep the sort of the flow. Essentially, what are you going to offer us for our allegiance? Russia is no longer really playing that game. So even before we look at Syria, Cuba, Venezuela, all these territories, basically, Putin is just washing his hands with them. But in pursuit of his war in Ukraine, he needs the Chinese. He needs the Chinese as political top cover. He needs the Chinese in access to Chinese technologies, to dual-use technologies. Remember, the Chinese are not giving any of this stuff. This is not aid. This is trade. And the Chinese know that they have Putin over a barrel. There's all this talk about, a friendship with no limits and so forth. A week ago, there was a video call between Putin and Xi Jinping in which Putin was saying, but when it comes to the relations between Russia and China, it is always spring. In practice, this is not a friendship with no limits. Frankly, it's a friendship with no benefits. This is a relationship in which the Chinese know that they are in the stronger position, and they use that position. They have managed to negotiate incredibly generous deals for Russian oil and gas, which in some cases are being sold for little more than cost. Generally speaking, the Chinese are pushing hard. Even the FSB, the Federal Security Service in Russia, is warning that Chinese espionage inside Russia is greater now than it was in 2022. Putin, though, no, he's not interested, he doesn't care, he can't afford to care. But, again, that next political generation down, that political generation who, frankly, is kind of looking at his watches, getting a bit impatient for when their time in the sun is going to be, they do not want to find that by the time they become the dominant figures in Russia, they are no more than the managers of a Chinese satrapy. So they're much more concerned about China. So think of it this way, a post-Putin Russian elite. It's not just that they want the goodies of being reconnected with the West. They want to hedge themselves against America. They want to avoid being sucked into the sort of the event horizon orbiting the black hole that is the Chinese economy. Where else can they go? Europe? Europe is the only place. India, Brazil, BRICS, none of these are going to do the job, Europe. So, there are practical reasons for the Russians to want to reconcile with us. Not least, and I did trail this, because Russians consider themselves to be European. That doesn't mean to say necessarily that we would consider them European in every sense, particularly not in terms of the values that are currently being espoused within Russia on an official basis. But culturally, historically, the Russians see themselves as Europeans. In many ways, they see themselves as the best of Europeans. They feel that the West has basically lost its way. It's got lost in this kind of wokery and such like, but they still cling to what really matters as being European. You can agree, I would personally disagree, but that doesn't matter, because they see themselves in those terms, and frankly, they're right. Russian culture, yeah, I mean, is it the same as ours in the UK? No, of course not. But to be perfectly honest, Finnish culture, Spanish culture, Greek culture are not exactly the same as ours either, but they fall within a broad span of European culture. Russia, likewise. Remember, this is a country whose elite, for much of the time, Russia's elite spoke French, not Russian. And Britain actually has a particular role here. I'm always fascinated by this weird relationship that the Russians have with Britain. They are at once Anglophobe and Anglophile. On the one hand, they love everything about Britain. Then they see Britain as this exemplar. I mean, we should be the Britain that Russians think we are. Exemplar, everything's right, sort of in terms of upright ethics and such like. I find it fascinating. I mean, as people have gathered, I am obsessed with Russia and have been since as long as I can remember, which means I've been traveling there since 1980 when I was 15. And the thing that strikes me is you can talk to people from all sorts of different walks of life and different constituencies, and they will all think that Britain does their thing better. Talk to Russian cops, and they seem to have this idea that British police are somehow a kind of amalgam of Sherlock Holmes and Dixon of Dock Green. Talk to Russian soldiers, and they're always exceedingly positive about the British Armed Forces. They are amazed that we've let them be run down so much. But whether it's the army or always saying the thing about the British is they can move fast. They get to places before they should. The Navy absolutely openly say that they regard the Royal Navy as the benchmark. Yes, the American Navy is bigger and so forth, but in terms of professionalism and skills, they always regarded the Royal Navy as the benchmark to which they aspire to. Academics, and again, they have a sense, obviously they're right, to think of British academics as the absolute intellectual pinnacle. And so it goes. I mean, I'm sure Russian grocers think that we're brilliant at that too, or whatever. I remember the second time I was in Russia, which was across New Year 1984-5. This is the time when the Soviet Union was already beginning to kind of run down, black marketeering absolutely rife. And we'd all heard stories about people who try and buy jeans off you and so forth. And I was in a hotel lift, and this almost out of central casting, rather kind of spivvy Russian came in, and I thought, I know what's happening now. But in fact, he didn't offer to buy the jeans off me or whatever. He sort of sidled up to me and says, "You have Agatha Christie?" There was even a huge black market for Agatha Christie novels in the Soviet Union. And this is something that has gone back a long time. Ivan the Terrible offered his hand in marriage to Queen Elizabeth I. It was an offer she felt she could refuse. And in part, it was probably him looking for a potential bolt hole. But even at that point, it was that sense of Russia, or Muscovy, as a mighty land power, allying with the preeminent naval power of the age. That sense that there was a particular connection, that Britain and Russia as the bookends of Europe, European but not quite European, had something in common. In the American Revolution, actually, the British tried to hire, before they hired Hessian mercenaries, they first turned to the Russians to try and see if they could hire Russian troops to put down the colonialists, the colonial powers. But it would have been fascinating if the Russians had said yes. And actually, we had owed success in quelling the American rebellion to the Russians. At the same time, though, the Russians also consider us to be their most devious and subtle antagonists. Nothing goes wrong in Russia without the MI6 being blamed for it somehow. I mean, if nothing else, we can think, at least someone thinks we really matter. And this is in part the great game, but it sort of the struggles over India and Afghanistan, but it predates that. So there is this constant sense that Britain is both, a potentially powerful partner and also a powerful antagonist. There is this sense that, protests and things, clearly they're all plots by the West to try and topple Putin. And I remember talking to a very hawkish Russian think tanker who was expanding at length about how the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity in 2014 had clearly been a CIA plot. And then he paused and he said, but I bet the British had the idea in the first place. The Americans have got the muscle, we've got the subtlety. So, Britain actually does still loom strikingly large within the Russian geopolitical imagination, shall we say. There will come opportunities. Not now, of course. Now any efforts must be just directed towards reaching as equitable a peace in Ukraine as possible. And it's going to be an ugly peace. Peace usually is. The idea that peace should be sort of fair and so forth, that's not actually, unfortunately, how the world works. But it gives us a chance to maybe redeem some of the failures of the 1990s, where not British Western policy towards Russia was often quite catastrophic. We often ignored Russia, we had our priorities elsewhere. We put all our faith in Boris Yeltsin, a man whom we thought of as a Democrat. He wasn't. He had no real vision. I mean, he was a rather limited provincial party boss who was a very, very good political infighter and an extraordinarily focused destroyer. When he had enemies, he was focused and powerful. But he had no vision for what kind of a Russia he wanted to build after he'd beaten those enemies. But still, as far as we were concerned, drunk and limited as he was our guy. 1993, he shells his own parliament in contravention of the Constitution. Oh, but that's all right. He then rewrites the Constitution to say it was okay all along. Constitutions don't work that way. But the point is, the parliament was full of rather unpleasant communists and nationalists, and we didn't like them either, so we said nothing. 1996, the communists were going to win the election. So the elections were massively rigged. Well, we hadn't wanted the communists to win either, so we just simply congratulate Yeltsin on his victory. And then we get surprised that the Russians think that we are sanctimonious hypocrites and that democracy is a sham or it's not for the likes of them. I'm not saying that we created Putin or anything like that, but nonetheless, we did help create the conditions that meant someone like Putin, a revanchist nationalist who was able to play the Russia has been ignored for too long card, could rise. So we have a chance to do something about that. Now, to conclude, here and now, it's very hard to think about reconciling with Russia. But there you go. Politics is often very hard. We often have to talk to deeply unpleasant people. I mean, the very fact that we are constantly fawning over the Saudi regime, or indeed desperately seeking Chinese investment, despite what each of those nations does, is a useful reminder of that. Yes, we need to hold Putin's feet to the fire. Yes, we need to continue to support Ukraine and such like, but nonetheless, we also have to think about our relationship with Russia in the future. And it may well be that really there's limited scope for anything while Putin is still in the Kremlin. But the point is, we have to be thinking now about where we are then, where we are that day that Putin doesn't wake up. And in that context, yeah, it is weird that what am I putting my faith in? I'm putting my faith in corruption and kleptocracy. That in fact, we can deal with pragmatic thieves. Why? Well, particularly in Britain, because we do it all the time, and we're really rather good at it. I'm putting my faith in the fact that Russia is now a very different country from where it was. The various foreign language services of the BBC, almost all of them have suffered substantially shrinking audiences. Not BBC Russian language. Now, it's no longer being beamed through shortwave. It's on the internet. Large number of Russians have VPNs, which is ways of bypassing the government controls on what you can and can't access online. And they're listening to the BBC. It's a generation now, or generations, who have traveled to the West. Some of them have studied in the West, who consume Western cultural material. I remember once walking down a street in Moscow, and all up one side of an apartment block was a huge mural of Marshal Zhukov, one of the great generals of, as the Russians call it, the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War. On the other side, again, filling up an entire side of an apartment block, was a huge advertising hoarding for a film that was coming out, Captain America. And to me, that is where Russians live. Between a kind of a nationalist propaganda campaign that is constantly being beamed at them, and also their own experiences, their own desire to connect to wider cultures. Russians have traveled now more than they ever have. Russians now live in a far more diverse information space than Soviet citizens ever did. And remember, Soviet citizens brought down the Communist Party. So, it's a very different Russia. It is a Russia in which people actually do have agency. My last point. Russians, we have a tendency to assume, there's this ghastly myth that Russians are naturally servile. They like the strong hand. They like to be told what to do. Russia's history is of riot and rebellion, of terrorism and turmoil. That's why Russian regimes have been so brutally authoritarian, because they fear their own people, and with good reason. In that context, when I talk about reconciling with Russia, we naturally think about, and to a large extent, I'm talking about the regime, whatever the government may happen to be. But it's also about Russians. I think something that we really have missed a trick on so far is actually reaching out to ordinary Russians much more and making it clear that we don't actually have anything against Russia. We don't really want to cancel Dostoevsky or whatever. We think Russians are great. I mean, we may or may not, but that would be the sort of the line. We have a problem with what the Russian regime is doing, and we regard Russians as victims, hostages of that regime. Now again, that's sometimes going to be flattering people. There are those who do support Putin's war, who do support Putin. But if we treat them all as proto-fascists who are fundamentally opposed to us, we're not going to make any friends. We need to be thinking about the fact that Russians are going to be there, Russia is going to be there. We have to find a way of reconciling with Russia that does not entirely compromise our values and our interests. And I'll stop there.
Okay, everybody, lots and lots of questions. Unlikely we'll get through them all, but obviously this evening's talk's given us all a lot of food for thought and prompted all these questions you can see in front of me. Lots of different themes as well, it's not concentrated on 2 or 3 issues. But I'll kick off with this one from Chris Hall. Have you got any information about Putin's state of health or life expectancy? I spoke to his doctor recently.
Yeah, I mean, given that, as I say, I suspect I'm going to have to wait for him to die before I can return to Russia. But I have high hopes. I have high hopes. There's always, I remember first time I heard the story that Putin had think it was blood cancer that time, anyway, and was going to die in 6 months. That was in the end of 2013. And we continue to get these rumors, which are frankly, I think more than anything else, wishful thinking. I do know that the CIA actually have medical doctors on retainer who they show every single bit of footage of Putin in order to try and get from them an assessment. And from what I heard, the answer is his health is depressingly okay. We know he has certain issues, he has back issues and so forth, but remember, this is a man who also has the best medical technology and treatment available. So, I mean, to be really depressive, I think it's his grandfather and father, or so anyway, so some of his relatives have lived into their 90s. So, we'll have to wait and see.
Well, perhaps picking up on legacy as well, Jane Shermer said, despite popular support, Putin still got rid of Navalny. And in the light of that, what hope is there for a democratic successor?
I mean, a democratic successor, I think pretty much none. The point about Navalny was exactly that he was dangerous for the very reason that he was doing something that pretty much no other Russian dissident leader was trying to or was able to do, which is to reach out beyond the kind of relatively privileged Moscow metropolitan middle class and connect to the wider protest potential. Russians are not very happy. They haven't been for a long time, for various reasons. The point is, in many ways, from Russians' point of view, the government is a bit like the weather. You can complain about it, but you know there's nothing much you can do about it, so you just endure as best as you can, particularly the Midlands weather. And in that context, look, as I say, I don't think that the next leader will be a Democrat. However, kleptocrats like law. They like law because once you've stolen everything, you want that to be then sort of fixed and protected. And you want to be able to then hand that ill-gotten wealth to your kids or whatever else. And the thing about law is an absolute essential prerequisite for democracy. One of the problems of Russia in the 1990s is they tried to have democracy without rule of law. That fails. Now, you can have rule of law without democracy, but you certainly can't have democracy without rule of law. So if we get a kleptocrat generation, they may be the ones who, for their own entirely self-interested reasons, create greater rule of law. And that might give the opportunity for the generation after to perhaps, touch wood, be the generation that begins to actually bring democracy to Russia. So this is why I think it's a two-generation thing. It's not going to happen now.
A few questions about, not surprisingly, about Ukraine. Linda Sherwood, you say Trump acted tough with Russia at the end of his last presidency, so why is he allowing Putin to destroy Ukraine? Is Putin calling his bluff?
It's because, in my opinion, Trump doesn't care about Ukraine. He wants this war over, A, to get him that Nobel Peace Prize that for whatever bizarre reason he's decided is his birthright, and B, because he made the rather incautious claim that he could end this war within 24 hours of becoming president. Now, so long as Trump believes that the line of least resistance lies through Ukraine, through Kyiv, in other words, that actually his best chance of peace is to bully the Ukrainians into accepting an ugly peace, then that's what he'll do. So I think it is just simply that Trump is self-interested and lazy, rather than anything else. There have been times when we've seen a kind of a flash of the teeth, and those almost invariably coincide with times when Zelensky, who has been an extraordinary advocate for Ukraine and Ukraine's cause, has been able to persuade Trump that in fact the Russians aren't in as strong a position as he thought. But then almost invariably Putin rings him up, and actually one has to recognize Putin is proving a very good Trump whisperer. There's many things that Putin is not good at, but he has proven depressingly good at that. He was once asked what his great talent, what he thought his greatest talent was. And he said, my greatest talent is I know how to work with people. Now, when Putin says work with people, he means get people to do what he wants them to do. And the sad truth is that is his one talent.
Well, on a similar theme, Paul Scott asked, with the US aid to Ukraine down by 90%, sanctions on Russia threatened but never implemented, destabilisation of NATO, if Trump isn't actually a Russian asset, what would he be doing differently?
I mean, the honest answer is, first of all, he would not be speaking so kindly about Putin. You know, if I was a case officer working in Yasinevo, which is where the headquarters of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service are, and I was running Agent Orange, from the first I've been saying, look, you need to basically be shouting your hatred of Russia at every corner, because then when you basically give us a victory, no one will assume it's because you're soft on Putin, on Russia. No, I mean, I think in practice, there is a lot that Trump could do. Trump could withdraw US intelligence support for Ukraine, which would actually have a serious impact on a lot of the tactical stuff about targeting and so forth. Trump could lean on Elon Musk to actually also block Starlink terminals within the frontline zone within Ukraine. Starlink terminals, which provide satellite-linked connections, actually are very important on both sides of the line for communication. Yeah, I mean, look, Trump is doing all kinds of things which are very, very helpful to the Russians. But that's because of Trump, in my opinion, rather than anything else. If you really wanted to mess with us, frankly, Putin should have got Trump to actually invade Greenland. I mean, that would have been an astonishing, cataclysmic, seismic event. But interestingly, Trump backed away from that.
Yeah, looking at internally in Russia, Nick Sharman asks, will the pressures of Western sanctions and the costs of the war, of its war economy, bankrupt Russia?
It's actually quite hard to bankrupt a country. The Soviet Union managed to mismanage and reform itself into collapse, but frankly it took 15 to 20 years to do it. And in many ways what Putin is doing is kind of speed running the Russian Federation through the same process. We are in the kind of late Brezhnevian era of Putinism. But unlike the Soviet Union, Russia is a thoroughly globalized economy. It's not just China, it's India, it's so many sort of the rising economic powers of the world are perfectly happy to work with Russia. Not for any political reason, but because they like that nice cheap oil. They like those weapon systems, all the other various things that Russia can offer. Sanctions do have an impact. There's often this very kind of crude sanctions. Are sanctions working? But the war's still going on, so sanctions must not be working. Well, that's not how sanctions work. I mean, if one looks at how long North Korea and Iran have survived under sanctions, and they're in much, much, much weaker positions. Sanctions essentially just put grit in the workings of the Russian war machine. For example, Russia can still get the microchips it needs for the guidance systems on its missiles and drones. But because it's having to use third-party facilitators, which some would call smugglers, and all sorts of other means of doing it, it's basically having to pay 3 times the world market price for those microchips. So it can still get them, but it's having to pay more for them. So sanctions, they are part of what is degrading the Russian economy. The Russian economy is sliding into recession at the moment. Inflation is relatively high, the base rate is very high, but authoritarian regimes can survive under these circumstances for quite some time because essentially they put the burden, the pain, on the masses and continue to spend on what they want to spend. The Russian police force is 25% under strength. The Russian health system is beginning to feel real pressures and such like. But that's not going to kind of bring the system down next Wednesday.
Got a question for the mic from the chap at the front here, please.
Thank you. Thank you for your lecture. You signed one of the books I bought for Yulia. She's a local Ukrainian lady, a lawyer, a charity worker and a translator. And she simply wants to know, as you know, next weekend's the 4th anniversary of the invasion. What do you think went through Putin's mind to make him actually do that?
My view is because he thought it was going to be easy. Putin is not, for all the bare-chested macho theatricals, Putin is not a risk taker. Quite the opposite, actually. When he's faced with a really tough decision, he tends to be paralyzed and hide from it. I think it's fairly clear that Putin had convinced himself, and again, this is where we come back to this blind spot he has about Ukraine. Remember, since before he was president, we have statements of Putin's where he says that basically he doesn't think Ukraine is a country. He doesn't think that Ukrainians are a people. And so I think he had convinced himself, and because he'd surrounded himself with a circle of cronies and yes men, no one, even though there were people in his circle who absolutely knew better, no one was willing to say, Vladimir Vladimirovich, it's not going to be like that. So he convinced himself that he could just basically roll into Kiev, topple the Zelensky government, Zelensky regime, as it is inevitably described by the Russians, impose a new leader who understood that Ukraine was part of Russia's sphere of influence and therefore its sovereignty was subordinated to Moscow's interests, and within a few weeks or months pull out. There will be a little bit of fighting here and there, but it's striking that a large proportion of the invading troops were not actually soldiers. They were members of Rosgvardia, the National Guard, which is actually an internal security force. You know, it was clear that they thought that riots would be a bigger likelihood than actual armed combat. Total and utter misunderstanding of Ukraine. And in many ways, Putin, if he's thinking about his historical legacy, Putin's historical legacy is he's the father of the Ukrainian nation. Because it's the crucible of this war that has truly brought all Ukrainians together. Catholic, Orthodox, West, East, you know, it doesn't matter. Russian-speaking, Ukrainian-speaking, Surgut-speaking, whatever. But nonetheless, that was it. I mean, Putin clearly did not think. I mean, if Putin had had a crystal ball and had known that he was getting into 4+ years of major war, 1.2 million casualties, dead or wounded, just the Russians, etc., I don't think he would have done it. But, you know, he had convinced himself that it was going to be easy and no one was willing to tell him otherwise.
Also, from a Ukrainian perspective, we've got a question from Pauline Meravitnov, I think it's pronounced. Apologies if I've got that wrong. And what she says is this: as someone who's also spent many years in Russia and Ukraine and is married to a Ukrainian, I found your talk very frustrating. Do you honestly believe people in the UK will see Russians as victims and end the culture of accountability and start enjoying Dostoevsky again? In other words, I think that's expressing the frustration and possibly anger of a lot of Ukrainians of any appeasement or rapprochement with the Russians.
I mean, it's a totally fair comment. And I mean, I tried to make it clear, but clearly wasn't successful. But what I was making the point was not that all Russians are Putin's victims, but rather that it makes practical sense for us not to treat all Russians as if they are Putin's willing and loyal accomplices. Because if so, we drive them all more and more into his camp. Actually, I would want us to see us trying to drive a wedge between the Kremlin and the Russian people. And to do that, yes, part of it is not to more or less say you are all accountable, because if nothing else, look, there have been many heroic Russians who have protested and stood up against this war. Most have not. Why? Because most of us, and I certainly include myself, are not heroes. When we know that the outcome of even just the smallest little one-person protest, holding up a no to war sign, is that within a matter of minutes, we will have been bundled into a police van, cracked over the knees with a rubber truncheon, dragged to a police station, and if we're lucky, just given a working over, if we're unlucky, being sent to prison for years, a Russian prison, most of us won't do it. We will grumble and we will complain and we will express our views over the kitchen table. But that's it. Unfortunately, that is the truth about authoritarian and increasingly totalitarian regimes. So, yes, I mean, many Russians, it has to be said, do support the war. They support the war in part because they are nationalists and so forth, and in some cases because they believe the nonsensical propaganda that the Kremlin puts out. But, as I say, if we treat all Russians as Putin's allies, we are more likely to make them Putin's allies. So it's more of a pragmatic political position rather than an attempt at a moral one.
Is there any more questions from the audience, by the way? Because we've got the mics knocking. Have we got a mic upstairs? I'm not sure. Yes, we have. Any questions? No hands going up? Right, okay. Get back to these questions. Getting away from Ukraine for a moment or two, Gio asks, what role do women play politically in Russia?
Yeah, the answer is that Russia is not the most enlightened country in that respect, but change is happening. I mean, in some ways, honestly, it's much closer to what you'd imagine, say, in 1970s, 1980s UK. The interesting thing is, there are some very powerful, very significant Russian women figures within politics. There is the Speaker of the upper house of the Russian parliament. I mean, she's a ghastly, ghastly woman, but nonetheless, she is a woman and she is in a politically powerful position. There is Elvira Nabiullina, who is the chairwoman of the Russian Central Bank. And frankly, I was at a workshop in Brussels a couple of weeks back, and this economist said, Nabiullina is Putin's secret weapon. And it's perfectly true. She has done an astonishing, depressingly good job of holding the Russian economy together despite sanctions. But this is the point. The women we see, they tend to be technocrats. So in other words, these are not the people in Putin's inner circle who actually have power because Putin listens to them. They are people who have functional, practical jobs. It's better than nothing. But again, it shows how there is a lot of highly educated, highly effective, highly efficient Russian women. And that is a human resource that the Kremlin doesn't want to waste. But I tend to think of Putin's sort of political system as being like an old-style stately home, upstairs, downstairs, or Downton Abbey. There's the lord of the manor and his friends having a party upstairs. And then there's all the below-stairs staff, whose job is to make sure that the party keeps running. And that's the technocrats. That's the prime minister, the cabinet, the chair of the central bank, all of these people. They're below-stairs. They are not the friends and cronies of Putin, who are on the whole not political figures. What's the point? If you're Putin's mate, why not just become obscenely rich? Why actually have to bother doing a job? So on the whole, these are people who own huge corporations which have basically just been handed to them by Putin's largesse. There are no women in that circle. So women can be powerful below stairs.
Is there any prospect of women moving downstairs to upstairs in the foreseeable future? I
mean, I think it is slowly changing. Particularly if you look at the next political generations down. I mean, again, it's a very familiar position that there are. I mean, if one looked at whether it's both the dissident movement and also in the ultra-patriotic pro-Putin movements, the 20-something and 30-something-year-olds, there are a lot more women who are active and significant there. So it'll happen over time. I mean, in many ways, Putin's project at the moment socially is to try and turn the clock back, just as he's trying to turn the geopolitical clock back to the days when the Soviet Union was sort of one of the great superpowers. But it doesn't work that way. The arrow of time just flies one way.
Well, talking about turning the clock back a bit, I've got an interesting question from Roger Hartley. Did the West mishandle relations with Russia in the immediate post-Gorbachev era?
I think I touched on this. I mean, yes, I think it did. Now, it's always dangerous to say this because it can sound as if you're saying basically it's all the West's fault. It's not. Ultimately, what Russia has become is because of what Russia has done and thought, and the fact that actually end of empire is difficult. As we know, Britain and France have completely got over being imperial powers. They had no element of a kind of overweening sense that they matter more in the world than anyone else thinks. But we had our Suez moment, the French had the Algerian War, as moments where they were sort of shocked into coming to realize that their countries were no longer what they once were. If there's anything good on the Russian side to come out of this ghastly war in Ukraine, it might be that this is that, for Russia, this is their moment, but it's still going to be generations to go. So, sorry, I was a bit of a sort of sideline, but I think a necessary sideline. And I think the trouble was that the West, I don't want to make it sound too touchy-feely, but didn't have empathy for Russia, what Russia was going through. It was traumatic, particularly because the Soviet Union was a contiguous land empire. It's not a country where your imperial possessions are conveniently on the other sides of seas and oceans. It's an empire where all the countries are butted into each other, and the populations were much more interpenetrated. There's a famous phrase that is often terribly misused, that Putin said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the greatest geopolitical calamities of the 20th century. Now, he didn't mean that in general terms. He meant that very, very specifically in that it left communities of Russians, as he would see it, stranded outside of Russia's borders. We didn't really pay any attention to that. We thought, hey, Soviet Union's over. There's a new Russia. They've all agreed. It's going to be fine. And we pretty much, and I say this as someone who spent some time attached to the Foreign Office during this time, so I'm also a guilty party, maybe. But we assumed that Russia would get over itself, get over its post-imperial pangs instantaneously. Doesn't work that way. Didn't for us, didn't for France, isn't going to when America goes through it. So I think, generally speaking, we did not handle the 90s well. And in that, we played some small contributing part to what we've got now.
You've said a number of times this evening that any change in Russia is likely to be a generational change and nothing's going to happen overnight. And I think quite a few people are quite surprised about that because, as David Martin says, the Russian population must be aware of the numbers of deaths and life-changing injuries in the war. And the point being is, will public opinion and public pressure not be influenced either the way in which the war's run or the way in which the country's run?
Putin has been clever in that he is not sending conscripts. He's not sending mobilized reservists. He's sending volunteers. Volunteers who are being offered a life-changing amount of money to go and fight. Equivalent to, salaries are equivalent to multiples of the overall wage. So this is, most wars are, but particularly this is a poor man's war. If you look at the correlation, there's some interesting work that's been done by a sort of actually largely an economics-based group called the Bell, where they correlated casualty rates with poverty rates in Russia's regions. And they map, with the exceptions of Moscow, Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and Chechnya, they map almost directly across. So basically, it is a war that is being fought by poor people from the poorest parts of Russia who are being offered huge amounts of money, and also huge amounts of money in death benefits for their families. In Dagestan, for example, again, one of the most impoverished regions of the Russian Federation in the North Caucasus, there was a lot of volunteers in the early couple of years of the war, and therefore clearly also a lot of dead Dagestanis. What was the result? The result was a building boom in Dagestan, as families that had got this money spent it on redoing the flat and whatever else. So much so that there was actually a shortage of builders and building materials in Dagestan. Now, in that context, for the Russians who are not there is almost this sense that the people who volunteer they are taking part in a particularly bloody lottery. You go there, you fight, most of them are going to come back. Not necessarily with every bit of themselves, but anyway, they're not going to die. But if you die, your family become very rich by the standards of these impoverished Russians, and if you survive, you also get a lot of money. So from their point of view, it's different from previous wars, like the Chechen War or the Afghan War, where you actually had people who didn't sign up for it. So first of all, I think there's a very different kind of perspective there. Secondly, and I'll keep this answer short because I know we're on for time, I can see lots of questions. At present, it's quite hard to truly gauge the scale of the casualties, especially if you are not from one of the very impoverished regions where there's been so many dead. If you live in Moscow, you probably don't know anyone who's in the war, let alone who died. Because Moscow is relatively affluent, and why would people sign up? It's really when the shooting stops and these soldiers come home or don't come home, that I think that's when we're really going to see the impact. We're going to see the impact because a lot of the people who do come home are angry, psychologically as well as physically scarred. They're going to feel that the promises they were given about how things would be after the war have been betrayed. But at present, they are still stuck in the war zone with relatively few options to have leave to come home and such like. So in some ways, Russian society is still immunized. But again, yeah, it's going to be a shock, but it's not necessarily going to be the kind of shock that changes the regime. It makes people angry, and the regime will have to do something about it, but not change.
Surely there's an amount of body bags going back to the villages that will have an impact. I mean, they do reckon there's over 1 million dead and wounded now in the war, don't they, in Russia?
Yeah.
And at what point do the death benefits actually not compensate for the numbers of body bags going home?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably about 300,000 dead of that tally, and about 900,000 seriously wounded. Maybe a little bit more, maybe 350,000 dead. I mean, that's a lot of people in a country, though, of 145 million population. But as I say, I think in many ways it's focused. I don't want to say that some impoverished village out in the boonies doesn't matter. Obviously, it matters for the people there. Politically, though, it doesn't matter. What are you going to do about it and such? It's very hard to build a protest movement, very hard to build lateral ties when the state, the secret police are constantly trying to do that. So you can have a village full of unhappy people, but what are they going to do about it?
Can I have the mic to this chap up here, please? Been anxious to ask a question.
Do I have to turn this on? No.
No, I don't think so.
Staying with Ukraine and assuming that there is peace at some point in the future, that seems inevitably to involve the cessation of certain Ukraine territories to Russia. What follows? Are the inhabitants of those territories likely to accept the situation, or is there going to be some sort of ongoing guerrilla war?
Well, let's be clear, there already is a guerrilla war. We hear very little about it, but that's simply because Western journalists have no access and the Russians are not talking about it. But we know that there are Russian internal security forces carrying out what they call chistki, combing operations to precisely hunt down people who continue to carry out sabotage and such like. The big question is this, is the cessation of territory, and it'll be de facto, not by law, it won't be internationally recognized, is it just kind of fixing the front line? In which case, you might see people behind the front line, a lot of them would have fled anyway if they didn't want to be under Russian rule. Or, as Putin is currently demanding, is there also this roughly 20% of one particular region, Donetsk region, that should be handed over? That's going to be the really thorny one, because there are 4 substantial urban settlements in this area, so-called fortress cities. If they are handed over, I mean, does it mean there's going to be suddenly sort of mass internal migration as people flee? Is it that one day people will wake up and suddenly there are Russian police and Russian troops in their streets? which could be a very turbulent moment. I don't know. I mean, this is precisely the kind of really thorny issues that are being discussed. Inevitably, though, not all, but most of the occupied territories, there are those there who are perfectly comfortable with the Russians being there. And there is no doubt going to be that we've already seen migration of essentially Russian colonists into cities like Mariupol. But there are also going to be many who are not. The prospect that Russia is about to acquire a huge Northern Ireland at the height of the Troubles should not be ignored. And I think this is one of the things that offers me some thought that even if there is a deal now that involves territories being handed over and Ukraine committing itself to not trying to take these territories back by force, I could imagine a situation in which 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the line, these territories end up returning to Ukraine, or at least part of them. And Russia just more or less thinking, we don't... Remember, this wasn't about conquest. This was about, originally, in 2022, this was about just simply putting in a puppet ruler. Putin didn't want to annex Russia. He didn't want to annex the bits of Russia that he already had, the bits of Ukraine that he already had in the east. So it's going to be messy.
Can we have the mic over here a sec, please? John.
We often hear about the concerns of the Baltic states, especially with their significant Russian-speaking minorities, which have not been integrated effectively. What do you see of their future and their future stability?
They're going to do fine. The interesting thing about the ethnic Russian or Russian-speaking minorities here is that before 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, they kicked up a lot of fuss about how, hey, we're being discriminated against. I mean, in fairness, actually, if anyone has ever tried to learn Estonian, I think being forced to learn Estonian does count as a human rights abuse. But they were just doing what you do in a democracy, is you find a fault line issue that you can build a constituency around, and you use that to lobby the central government for resources. That's essentially democracy. After the annexation of Crimea, I was talking to an officer from Kapo, which is the Estonian security police. And he was saying it was really interesting how quickly attitudes changed. Because before that point, you could play the "we're disgruntled Russians and Moscow is our big daddy over the border" card, but suddenly that became very real. And when it came down to it, if you're an ethnic Russian, you have a legal right to go to Russia. You can just simply go and get your Russian citizenship, your Russian passport. It's enshrined in the Constitution. But they don't. Why? Well, because they would decided that on balance, they would rather be members of a relatively prosperous, dynamic, liberal, democratic European Union country. So I think there's a lot of overplay. And frankly, I know the Estonians get very, very... Estonian government gets very annoyed with this idea that, for example, the city of Narva, that is just over the border from Ivangorod, would sort of rise up and welcome the Russians if Russian little green men came over the border. No, that wouldn't happen. There's now, just as it's worth noting that there's a disproportionate number of Russian speakers within the Ukrainian armed forces. Actually, there's also a disproportionate number of Russian speakers in the Estonian armed forces. It could well be the same in Latvia and Lithuania, but I just don't know the stats there. So, look, they are in the front line, absolutely. And they're also precisely the place that Putin kind of tends to prod when he wants us to pay attention, because he knows it's regarded as a vulnerable region. But actually, first of all, if Putin made a move on the Baltic states, A, the Balts would fight, B, the Poles would join in, regardless of what NATO was doing. The Poles would not sit back and just let their flank be turned by the Russians. The Poles have a long and acrimonious history with Russia, and they are arming at an incredibly fast rate. Within 2 years, the Poles will have more modern main battle tanks than the Russians. So I think actually the Balts are fine. But it is politically useful for them to sometimes play up the vulnerability card, because it gets them resources and attention from the West. So it's a complex position.
One last question from the floor, this chap down here.
No pressure, but maybe a good question then.
We often hear Steve Rosenberg reporting from Moscow, and I'm surprised at how much freedom he appears to be allowed in what he says. Why is this?
Well, reason number one is because Steve's a legend. Reason number two is, look, the Russians don't want to kick every Western journalist out, because if they did, we would kick every Russian journalist out. But reason number three is the Russians, I think, or the Kremlin, appreciates having at least some kind of continued... I mean, I don't want to make it sound as if Steve's a sort of a Russian instrument, but a channel to the West. I mean, it's quite striking. I mentioned this big Putin telethon. You know, Steve went. He didn't know if he was going to be called on to ask a question. Quite early on in the journalistic element, Dmitry Peskov, who's Putin's spokesman, called on Steve Rosenberg, who asked what was frankly a very combative question, especially considering that the Russian journalists asked questions like, you know, what is your favorite color, and are cats nice? And I think, again, the Russians appreciate, when I keep saying the Russians, when really I mean the Kremlin, appreciates having that kind of opportunity to show, you see, we're willing to have people ask Putin tough questions, and Putin will rise and actually give it a proper answer. So I think it's all of those, plus one last thing is Steve is very good at knowing exactly how far you can go. When we've seen some of the other journalists fall foul of the Kremlin, it's often because they've gone past those lines. Steve is very, very good at knowing the lines and actually going up as far, you know, actually then tests those lines without crossing them. Could change tomorrow. But he and Ben, his producer, co-reporter, they are doing an amazing job. And I don't envy them. But I thank God that they're still there.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and apologies to those people who asked to put questions in and we didn't have time to ask. Thank you very much, Mark. Very interesting, insightful lecture. We hope you come back in a few years' time and give us some better news about Ukraine and the future of Russia.
Health.
But please join me in thanking Mark Galeotti this evening.